In Costa Rica, we've had a very hostile government until last month. And now we have a good government. So the Minister of the Environment called me up and he said, well, we don't want you to come here under arrest. We want you to come here as a hero to Costa Rica. Well, which is a big difference from what it's been for the last 10 years. So things can change just like that with the change of the administration. So we really just have to adapt to whatever is there. My view on politics is that we're not right, we're not left, we're just trying to protect the planet, which is something everybody has in common, no matter what their political spectrum or religious beliefs are, or whatever, that's what we have in common. And the way I see it with governments is, well, first of all, I don't think governments really solve any problems, they cause problems. Individuals' passion, that's what solves problems. If you look at any social movement in the history of the planet, it's always been the passion of individuals that has brought about social change. And it's this pendulum that swings. Now it's the right, now it's the left. You just wait around and it comes back. Unfortunately, we have a president who's trying to undo all the policies of the previous president. The next president will be trying to undo the policies of this president. And one of these days we'll have a rational president. But until then, you'll just have to do what you can with the resources you have to the best of your ability.
Thank you. Ellie, as being someone who's worked in sub-Saharan South Africa for the last 35 years and the many changes you see, as a foundation, how do you find, not even necessarily funding, but partnering, working in those areas to put your best effort forward? Does it become discouraging when your strategy works, it takes a while to implement, but then it gets shut down? How does that feel from a foundation standpoint and how you allocate your resources?
Well, first of all, we're invited in wherever we go. So we never just walk in and say, hey, here we are, we're going to do this for you. So by being invited in, we're requested to help implement something they have come up with, a solution they feel that will address their challenges, whether it's wildlife conflict, livestock conflict, problems with other communities, people coming in from elsewhere, water pollution. So we work with people and on the ground resources. So discouraging, I'd say the only thing that's discouraging is how rapidly off the rails in the last 30 to 50 years we have gone. Humanity has taken our planet. In the 60s, we had this all figured out. We knew what we were going to do. We knew habitat had to be protected, and then it went into saving species and biodiversity hotspots, and then umbrella species, then keystone species, and we kept going down more and more kind of rabbit holes. Now we sort of got the attention on these iconic species, but we've forgotten that the whole thing is connected by the skin of the earth. And by destroying the skin of the earth, the water that connects it, which is the lifeblood of the entire planet, and the lungs of the planet, the air, we have to sort of start from ground zero again. So the discouragement comes from not so much what's happening in the communities I work with, but how rapidly everything has gone off the rails that we have to deal with in a whole new situation. So it's practically, I don't want to say it's completely starting from ground zero. It's like, what's the next wild idea? And it's kind of constantly changing as we see not only our current president unravel our protections, but as African countries take on this economic growth model as the bestest, brightest, shiniest thing, and the destruction of wildlife and habitat in favor of it. And the economic models and infinite growth on a finite planet just aren't going to ever come together. So it's coming back around to find ways to implement in situ strategies where communities are deeply involved, have buy-in, want to do it, and you help make it happen and do whatever it takes.
And Brian, can you also put in your thought on that question, be it that you're based pretty much in Africa?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that there's no magic recipe for success. I think the key to the success is a perfectly stocked pantry. You know, so you can make that recipe, but also you can adapt it, you can change it, because I tour around and I lecture and I talk to all different types of people in colleges, universities, zoos, you name it. And it amazes me how many people think that Africa's a country, you know, and there's 55 countries within Africa, the African continent. Within the outline, you know, you can fit the whole of the United States, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, China, Japan, and you know, it's absolutely massive. So you know, you have to adapt. Even in Namibia itself, which if you don't know Namibia, it's around about the size of Texas. I mean, we work with all different peoples. Apparently, we're not allowed to call them tribes anymore. They don't care, but it's not PC to call them tribes. But the peoples, I mean, like the Herero people, you know, there's no quick fix for the Herero people. You know, and when you start to research the people that you're dealing with, I mean, if you look back 100 years for the Herero, they were the subject of the first genocide of the 20th century. You know, whatever you've learned about the Holocaust and the Second World War happened first in Namibia in early 1900s. So that kind of answers a question when a white European walks in and tries to tell them what to do. So it's a very slow process sometimes. And like I said before, when we build these models, you know, you have to be fluid. And sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel, which a lot of conservationists have tried to do in the past. I mean, one of our biggest projects is our livestock guarding dogs. You know, we use dogs, the Anatolian Shepherd dogs, that have been used in Turkey for the last 5,000 years, protecting small livestock against large predators. Ta-da! You know, so we've started that. We've reduced the losses of livestock to predators by between 80 and 100%. So that kicks off something, because then you've taken the fear and the hatred away. And it would be a crying shame to walk away then, because then you've taken the fear and the hatred, and once you do that, you open up the mind for education. And then you can start to educate the farmers a bit more about the predators and the other wildlife being an ally, you know, keeping the numbers down. You know, if the predators are not there, then the old, the weak, the injured and the stupid all survive, all drinking the farmer's water and eating the farmer's grass. So it goes on from there, and you're making them better farmers. So you can't go in just looking at one species. That's a recipe for disaster. And just to close up, my biggest battle over the years has been being a buffer. And I'm basically the buffer between idealism and realism. You know, and there's a huge difference, and you have to balance those two, you know, for success. And also, like I said before, we've been around for 28 years as the foundation, and ownership of this research and these developments is almost a crime. You know, if people do the research and they hold it, you know, like BMW would hold on to their secrets against Mercedes, you know, you need collaboration. You need these people doing it, because we can't be in all these different places. And it's not just the predators that in Africa. You know, the similar systems can be used in the US with the wolf problem, you know, the reintroduction of the wolves and the guarding of the livestock against them. The same methods or similar methods can be done, but you can't pick up. It's not off the shelf. You know, the ingredients are there. You just have to mix it slightly different.
Thank you. And this leads me to another question about working with other organizations. I know, you know, initially when we started our nonprofit about 6 years ago, we ran into the same difficulty of other organizations holding those keys and not wanting to work, whether it's in Indonesia, Africa, or these other areas, and share that knowledge and try and come up with a comprehensive solution. And starting with Will, can you tell us how that works when you're working with the BLM and you're working with some of these that have very political motivated ideas, and you're trying to work to preserve the environment, and they might have other ideas, as in overgrazing with cattle or not handling the Mustang population. So tell me how you work with other organizations to kind of overcome those problems.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably maybe two ways to answer that. One is working with federal agencies, Forest Service, BLM. People were essentially trying to convince to do a better job. and the other is with other nonprofits. I think for the, for the federal agencies, for all the people we're trying to convince, you kind of have to make the call. Are you going to try and work with them? Can you have enough of a common ground to influence and work on it together, or do you have to have a bit more adversarial relationship? I think in general we're most successful when we can find common ground and partnership with those federal agencies. Some of the best ways to do that, I think, are to bring larger groups to the table. I mean, they're political bodies, and so ultimately they want to see as big a buy-in as possible. So if you can be a convener and a facilitator when we're working on like a campaign for New Wilderness, we're much more successful if we can have veterans and ranchers and the recreational community coming in there and saying, we think this is a good idea as well. I think with other nonprofits, oftentimes it's kind of just a history of what's happened there. I think we're lucky in Colorado. There's a real sense of collaboration. Everybody tends to get along well. There's other places in the U.S. where the public lands conservation community is much more fractured. Places like Montana, there's just kind of a different shared history there that can make it tougher.
Do you find it hard to work with the recreational people? Because I am one of those guys that live here in Colorado, and I know that could be really difficult.
I think that it's changing really quickly as a lot of these, as the technology changes, and Colorado's kind of ground zero for it. There's more and more people moving here, and there's more and more ways to have fun in the woods, which in general is good. We want people out there, realizing how important public lands are. And at the same time, the land management agencies can't keep up with all these new people out there. And there's just an article in the paper yesterday that the wildlife in the kind of the Vail to Aspen area, the elk herd is diminished by half in the past 10 years. There's no one, factor for that, but a lot of it has to do with there's just more of us out there. So in terms of working with the recreation community, I think there's a lot of shared understanding that needs to happen that people don't realize their impacts. And so we've got a ways to go to, even going out and backpacking or hiking has an impact. I think the places we've been most successful is where there's trust, where you've been working for a long time. So you can't make it happen overnight. You need to build those relationships for years so that when you get to kind of a thorny issue, you've got the trust to work through it.
Cool, thank you. Paul, I was listening to your presentation earlier, and I did not know, I know the anti-poaching work you guys have done. I did not know that you guys actually are, when you get the netting, or turning that in, whether it's the Adidas or the other things you're doing with the plastics you're collecting. On top of that, knowing that our oceans are severely polluted, and plastic being a big issue with that, which I would say everyone please stop drinking straws. It's a big deal. But how do you work, and I know you're focused on anti-poaching, but do you tend to work also on the side of helping clean that up or notifying other organizations when you come across these almost floating islands out there?
Well, we work with Parley for the Oceans, for example. They take the plastic from us and give it to people like Adidas to convert. That one Southern Ocean campaign, we brought back one net. It was 72 kilometers and weighed 70 tons. So that made a lot of running shoes. The nets that we took from Mexico, some of those nets went to Stella McCartney, and she created a designer bag, which she sold, and the proceeds went back towards our work on that. So we do try to, and also all over, Sea Shepherd chapters all over the world have beach cleanups every week, and we collect the plastics and recycle it as best we can. The problem is really is we have to get away from recycling. We have to find alternatives to plastic. And why do they call it a straw? Because originally it was a straw. And I was in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. recently, and they actually had straws. And that's really what we should go back to. Why do we call it peanuts and popcorn for the packing material? Because it originally was peanuts and popcorn. And so we don't need these styrofoam things. There are natural alternatives to it. So we really have to get, plastic is really a design failure, and we need to have alternatives to that. It's very important that we do.
Fantastic, thank you. Brian, on top of the conversation that both of these gentlemen are having, I know that Lori, Dr. Marker, and you guys do a lot of your fundraising comes from other projects, a lot of strategies you've implemented that are almost business-like that pulls in funding. Could you talk a little bit about some of those?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that's probably most relevant to AREI-AREDAY is the loss of habitat, which is one of the factors that's affecting so much. You know, again, yes, it is affecting the cheetah, and that the name is on my shirt. So, you know, that was maybe the focus, but you know, it was the biggest cause of desertification in southern Africa. So this invasive thickened thorn bush was taking over. And like I said before, you know, you can't look at it as an idealistic thing. You can't overreact. You can't look at it and say, you know, the problem is the bush, get rid of the bush. You know, well, it's a native plant. It's supposed to be there, but just not that much. So what's caused it? So again, doing the research, doing the finding out the reasons why. And one of the biggest reasons was the loss of the giant herbivores that used to, you know, freely roam Africa. You know, an elephant is nature's bulldozers, you know, clearing these passageways. So now the elephants are not there, so the bush is taking over, no grass grows. You know, the farms in Namibia, or the ranches in Namibia, as you might call them, they're huge, maybe 10,000 hectares each. But it takes around about 35 to 40 acres to graze one cow. So going in there and almost like do what the elephant does, but don't get rid of the bush, but harvest the bush, create these corridors. And then we ended up with a load of bush. So we developed a way of chipping it, using heat extrusion presses, only employing local indigenous people to do that and work on it. And then we produced a totally eco-friendly fuel log. So, you know, it's a kind of and that is almost self-funding at the level that it is now. So, and the same with the livestock guarding dogs. Once you earn that trust, you know, we opened up avenues of education and alternative livelihoods there. So instead of just using boar goats in their herd, introducing dairy goats, teaching the farmers' wives how to make cheese. You know, feta, ricotta, mozzarella. It's incredibly simple. You know, all you need is a fire and a pot, basically, you know, and you can make this. So all of those different things like that. So you're just not looking at the problem that's in front of you. You know, you're working on that and working on ways and diverse ways to almost make it self-sustainable and bringing in people. You know, you don't have to know everything when you're doing this. I mean, my philosophy is that I want to surround myself by everybody that's better than me. You know, I want them so good that the only job left for me is to make the tea. You know, as long as the job's getting done, then happy days. You know, ego plays no part in conservation on the front line.
Thank you. Ellie, you have a pretty successful podcast and have been doing this, like I said, a long time. Can you tell us, tell the audience here, a strategy that you're very proud of, that you were able to implement over your last 35 years that has really, in your heart, made a good impact and it's just brought to the forefront. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, thank you for mentioning my podcast, Our Wild World. It's an almost 7-year running program where I have the opportunity to learn from a wide variety of guests and experts and thought leaders across the world what they do to make conservation happen. So I have that sort of in my back pocket to draw from. So it really helps me to implement other strategies when somebody comes to me saying, we've got this problem, can you help? So I can draw all this together because I'm constantly learning. Like just now, listening to you, WildiZe works in such a wide variety of situations that are different and across a continent that is completely different from Kenya, Tanzania, over to Namibia and Botswana. So there is no reinventing, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Mm-hmm. And Will brought up, you know, and you mentioned the recreation. So we, Europeans, go to recreate in Africa. Africans are not recreating in their wildlands. They're trying to survive. So it's a whole different set of tools in the toolbox when you're trying to talk with a community who's got a problem of too many cattle, too many lions, or just, you know, lions eating cattle, and tourism, eco lodges, all these things that are the Western model of progress that aren't necessarily the best thing for the community. And as Brian said, huge swaths of land. And you know, Corey from WPS, that it's not instant response. It takes a while to get there. There's not cameras everywhere. There isn't internet everywhere. So you have to pull together a wide range of expertise, people on the ground who know and have experience, as Paul had said and as Brian said, and make use of all these tools that you have at your fingertips and weave them together and help people communicate to each other. A lot of times the worst thing is just not talking to each other. So I'm often called a community liaison. I bring everybody together, and it's kind of like being a moderator or a liaison or whatever, and everybody can just voice their opinion and hash it out, and then we come away from that with a strategy. And it's no one size fits all. It's never going to be that because it's always changing. And now we have climate change, we have desertification, we have deforestation, we have polluted water, we have polluted air that is changing everything even more and putting a whole different kind of pressure on these way rural communities that have no connection to anything else. Their community is everything. And it will take 3-5 days to go see the next community. And maybe once every 3 to 6 months, they'll have a big, larger convention kind of conference. So you have to pull a lot of things together. So the strategy is stay fluid, listen. We have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth for a reason. Know what to keep open and what to keep shut, and when. So it's a constantly shifting landscape. It's exciting. So the strategy is, we've got to keep moving forward. We've got to be creative. We have to think differently than we've ever thought before, and we have to use the tools, every tool that we have at our fingertips.
Chip, I think we got your next moderator next year. I'm good. Guys, we're going to open it up for questions. Please raise your hand, bring a microphone, and say your name and who you're with, and direct your question to the right person, please. We'll start with this gentleman right here. And you can stand up, too.
When you're talking about the changing landscape in Africa as a continent, I know that there's issues around ownership and property rights. In certain countries, there's issues around the indigenous people coming back and claiming their lands. Is this an issue that you two work with? And if so, is it a growing issue or not?
Brian.
Who are you asking?
Either one of us, I think.
Either one of the two experts?
I haven't answered. I'm sure Brian has an answer.
I'm just curious. Thank you.
So, may I?
You go ahead.
In Kenya especially, of this past year, property rights have become a big thing with First Peoples. You might have all heard of the land invasions and the cattle invasions that were going on in Samburu, Laikipia area, of people who were there first, and the white European who has taken, one narrative is the white European has taken all the best lands and built their eco lodges and created their NGOs and closed it off, and for their ecotourism and their projects, and have left the First Peoples or the natives or the tribes or the locals, whatever you want to call them, non-whites, non-Europeans, to fend for themselves in a drought. So Africa across sub-Saharan is facing worse and worse droughts ever since 2004. So massive die-offs, massive need for grazing lands. There's also a massive increase in the amount of cattle as wealth. So, with foreign aid, a massive increase of building wells. So now you've got cattle moving across a landscape where before there was no water. And now you're degrazing, deforesting in much larger areas. So you have to address First Peoples, and how far back do you go? That's the first question. So, and that is going to change. So the Herero is one. In East Africa, it can go back up to Sudan, up to Somalia, up to Ethiopia. So where do you stop or where do you go? So the best thing is just, I find, bring everybody together and try and find a compromise and a strategy that everyone has a stake in. We all need to sit at the table and find out what we want. In the end, we want land, we want water, we want air, and we want wildlife. How are we going to do that?
Yeah, and I'll add on there a little bit. In South Africa and some of the other regions of Africa, it's becoming a big issue, and it's scaring a lot of people out of wildlife, period. They're giving up their lands to people who actually don't know how to even put crops on there or to care for the wildlife that's existing on there. They tend to just let it go away, which is a big problem. You know, when Zuma left South Africa just recently, thank God, and Ramaphosa's now the president, and he said they're still going to do land grabs and he's not going to compensate for them. That's leading to even a bigger problem and a little bit scarier issue, which we'll be dealing with. But he did say, which the previous administration never said, which is if they don't, if they give the land to someone who has rights to it, pre-existing rights, and they don't take care of the land and still bring something back, as in the farmland, so they don't provide food, or they don't take care of the habitat, whether it's an eco-tour or a hunting lodge, for instance. If they're not doing that, then the government can take the land back and sell it. So that is a positive step in a direction, which is nice, but you're still not being compensated for the land you've had for the last 100 years. So you're seeing people start to get scared and just get out. For me, that's a bad equation because it makes it much harder to protect wildlife when you have issues like this, especially when people don't understand what it takes to actually manage wildlife. It is extremely scary to me.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
You know, I hear the phrase a lot about wildlife management. Wildlife knows exactly what it needs to do.
Yeah.
It needs space to do it. It needs food. It needs security. And it needs safety from other predators and from people. What we have to find a better way to do is manage the people.
True.
And how they're going to live on this landscape so that they can have a lifestyle and a life way and benefit, not just necessarily economically as dollars, but on the last panel, I think I should have been on the last panel because the benefit is, and I've been saying for years on my podcast, you know, we've got to shift our mindset of what the equation of health and wealth means. We always define wealth as our pocket and our portfolio, dollar bills with faces on them. We have to define our wealth as the richness of the resources on the planet that gives us and everything life. And that benchmark has to turn around.
Well said. Next question. Any others out there? Just? End of the day, people get tired.
So, Captain Paul, to the Sea Shepherd Society's ocean plastic recycling strategy, that seems to be a powerfully effective way to begin to reduce the massive quantities that are building up in the gyres around the various oceans of the Earth. And I'm wondering if you can think of a way of accelerating that, like bumping it up to the power of 10 through some sort of a collaboratory strategy whereby, I mean, obviously we have to stop producing the plastic, but can we recover it from the oceans, make it into products that are so in demand that, you know, we clean up the, I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, it's really difficult, I think, to recover plastic from those ocean jars because it's extremely expensive, and there's also a high mortality in wildlife when you start extracting it from in different ways. I think one positive thing is that there are bacteria that are evolving that are going to eat it, and nature will eventually take care of that. But the real problem is with microplastics, and those microplastics are getting into zooplankton, and that gets into the fish, and if you eat fish, you've got microplastic in your bodies. And that's just the reality of it. And where does that microplastic come from? It comes from places we don't even think about. Not just plastic waste, but your automobile. Every time there's a study in Norway shows that 40% of the microplastic came from the car tires, because as you go down the road, you're losing pieces all there, and it all gets washed down into the ocean. So we don't even know where this stuff is coming from, but we do know that it's being extremely destructive, and you can only really recycle so much of it. It's just mind-boggling how much plastic is being produced. I think Evian alone produces 100 billion bottles every year. You know, Coca-Cola's in the billions too. So it's just incredible amounts of plastic, and those are just the plastic bottles. It's really gotten out of control. And what disturbs me is when we hear people say, well, you know, by 2030, 2040, we'll have this under control. The ocean doesn't have that time, really. And so what I would say is that we stop using plastic now, 100% across the board. It's probably not going to happen, but that, I think, is the only solution.
Follow-up comment, the source of plastic is oil.
Well, yeah, the source, of course, is oil, and it's a petroleum product. There are, of course, other forms of plastic, bioplastic or whatever. I'm not so sure those are good things. But, you know, we all got along real well without plastic prior to, say, 1950. I remember as a child walking on the beach in eastern Canada, I never saw a single piece of plastic. I mean, we saw a lot of bottles and glass fish balls, which are now worth a lot of money, but they were very common back then. So there was a world before plastic, and it's really a design flaw in our culture that we never thought about it. We never thought about in fact, in 1985, I wrote an article about it, and I had actually had Greenpeace call me up and say, why are you putting out this kind of information? It's alarmist. You're just making people upset when there's no need for them to be upset. And plastic actually is a good habitat for a lot of marine life. It's a good thing. And so it was very, very difficult to finally get this message across. But now, of course, the message is here, and there are a lot of people who are coming up with innovations and ideas, and that's a very healthy thing.
Are you finding when they, I've been reading a lot about this, when they're finding dead whales washed up on the beach or whatever, and they're opening them up and they're finding plastics abundantly inside of them. How is it, can you actually, how do you resolve that? Because that's just going to be a continual problem if we wait for the plastic to be, I guess, naturally taken care of.
One of the saddest films that's out there right now is Chris Jordan's film Albatross, which just shows the incredibly high mortality of albatross on Midway Island from the ingestion of plastic. But it's into seals, it's into whales. Whales are dying, dolphins are dying. Fish are ingesting this. It is a major threat to the survival of life in our oceans. And one of the things, of course, is the incredible amount of plastic used in nets and long lines. In fact, if you were to take all the long lines and nets right now, right in the ocean, right now, there's 10 million fishing boats. It could go around this planet 60 times. That's an incredible volume. And how do we get rid of it? Again, when I was a child, I lived in a lobster fishing village. Every one of those lobster traps was made of hemp or manila. And if they lost them, well, they eventually just rotted away. But now they're there, and they just keep killing and killing and killing. And ghost nets, ghost traps. So it's a very destructive invention, and we just have to put an end to it, or else we're not going to survive.
Can I add something to that?
Mm-hmm.
When I first went to East Africa 30 years ago, there was no plastic bag in the communities in the rural areas. They weren't there. And it was in the mid to 2000s that as I'd start driving across the Chalbi Desert and the lava flows that I started seeing these shining things. And that's when plastic started becoming a problem. So we did implement some plastic cleanup issues in communities. And there was something else you had said, that the nets used to go away. So waste management across the communities where I work has only recently become a problem with plastic and waste that doesn't go away. Mm-hmm. Previously, they used gourds, calabash, straw, palm leaves. It all biodegraded. So they would just leave it. You know, when they packed up and moved with the seasons, the rain, the grasses, they just leave what they didn't eat and it went away. It doesn't do that anymore. So that's part of the problem. And We've been trying to address this, people like Paul and I and so many, for 30, 40 years, and it's now a crisis. And as Paul had said, we can each do it every day. Get rid of what you don't need that's plastic that will never go away. Simple.
And go to the supermarkets. They're now individually wrapping potatoes and apples and everything into plastic. And one person had a great idea. You get your stuff, you go up to the counter, you unwrap it, leave it there, and take the produce.
Yep.
And they'll get the message.
It's a great idea. We have time for one more quick question. You.
Hi. I'm glad we're talking about microplastics, but I think that I worked on a project involving microplastics in the South Pacific last year, and I think the biggest problem was the way we communicate about it having to do with a lot of people thinking that the plastic sitting in the fish is the problem, when the actual problem is the organic pollutants that attaches itself to the plastic and releases itself in the endocrine systems of those fish. So can you speak to what you've seen as far as the fish population and species and how fit they are to protect themselves in your time at work, and how you might strategize communicating that piece of the puzzle to the greater populations and the importance of the problem from that perspective?
Well, you're right about the fact that different chemicals attach themselves to these microplastics, and that's a source of toxicity to a lot of these species. But as far as the diminishment of fish, there's so many factors on there. There's plastic, there's acidity, there's overpredation, illegal fishing, just goes on and on. The big problem, the single biggest problem in the world today, to me, is the diminishment of biodiversity in our ocean. And when that collapses, the ocean collapses. When the ocean collapses, the ocean dies, we die. It's as simple as that. So if we're going to survive, we have to address these problems.
Thank you guys very much.
And I just want to say one thing. It's gone full circle. We now have evidence of the first poached elephant that had ingested plastic and would have eventually died of plastic in its system. So it's gone from us into the rivers, into the streams, into the ocean, and now it's right back. It's a big problem.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.